Chapter 1. An Unexpected Discovery at Elderflower Lodge. The annual Elderflower Lodge garden party was, by all accounts, the social highlight of St. Mary Mead's summer calendar. For 63 consecutive years, the Pettigrew family had opened their immaculately manicured grounds to the village elite, and this year's event promised to be no exception. Colonel Archibald Pettigrew, a military man of impeccable bearing even at 78, stood at the entrance to the sprawling lawn, greeting guests with a firm handshake and the occasional jovial comment about the weather, which had mercifully decided to cooperate. "Miss Marple, delighted you could join us," the colonel exclaimed as the elderly lady approached, dressed in her customary neat, old-fashioned attire, a pale blue dress with a touch of lace at the collar, sensible shoes, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the June sunshine. "How kind of you to invite me, Colonel," Miss Jane Marple replied with a gentle smile. Her faded blue eyes, sharp despite their apparent mildness, took in everything. The Colonel's slightly strained expression, the tension in his shoulders, and the way his gaze kept darting toward the elaborate Victorian greenhouse that stood at the far end of the garden. "Wouldn't dream of excluding our village's most distinguished resident," the Colonel said heartily, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do try the strawberry tarts. Mrs. Wilson has outdone herself this year." Miss Marple nodded appreciatively and made her way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces. St. Mary Mead was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. As she accepted a glass of homemade elderflower cordial from a silver tray, she observed the various groupings with interest. By the rose garden, Florence Pettigrew, the Colonel's daughter-in-law and mistress of Elderflower Lodge since his wife's passing, held court with the vicar's wife and Dr. Haydock. Florence was a handsome woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a cream linen suit that emphasized her trim figure. Her laugh, a little too loud, suggested a certain nervousness beneath her poised exterior. Near the croquet lawn, her husband James Pettigrew, the Colonel's only son and heir to the estate, was engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with Howard Blackwood, the local solicitor. James, a man perpetually overshadowed by his father's military accomplishments, had the hunched shoulders of someone carrying an invisible burden. His receding hairline and prematurely lined face made him look older than his 46 years. "Quite the gathering, isn't it?" remarked a voice at Miss Marple's elbow. She turned to find Inspector Craddock, who had recently been transferred to the area from London. Though not officially on duty, the young policeman had a natural curiosity that served him well in his profession. "Colonel Pettigrew certainly knows how to entertain." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I believe this might be the last such party for some time. I understand the greenhouse renovations begin next week." "The famous orchid collection," Craddock nodded. "Quite valuable, I'm told." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The Colonel is quite passionate about his orchids, rather like my nephew Raymond's father-in-law and his roses. Such an obsession can be consuming." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the newest residents of St. Mary Mead, Diana and Victor Carmichael, who had purchased the old Simmons cottage just 3 months ago. Diana, at least 20 years younger than her husband, wore a fashionable red dress that seemed rather out of place at the genteel gathering. Victor, a retired professor with distinguished silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, kept a proprietary, hand on his wife's back as they moved through the crowd. "The Carmichaels seem to be settling in well," Craddock observed. "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied, "though I believe Professor Carmichael knew the Colonel years ago. Something to do with their time in India, I understand." The afternoon progressed pleasantly enough, with cucumber sandwiches consumed and village gossip exchanged in equal measure. Miss Marple noted with interest the way Florence Pettigrew avoided any interaction with the Carmichaels, and how James seemed to grow increasingly agitated as the party wore on, repeatedly checking his pocket watch. At precisely 4 o'clock, Colonel Pettigrew tapped his glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. As some of you know, this is a special occasion. The 50th anniversary of when my father first built the Elderflower Lodge greenhouse. To mark the occasion, I'd like to invite you all to view the new orchid specimens that will be the centerpiece of our renovation project." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd as they followed the Colonel toward the magnificent glass structure that dominated the eastern edge of the property. Miss Marple noticed how Diana Carmichael whispered something to her husband, who frowned and shook his head sharply in response. The greenhouse was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, all wrought iron and crystal-clear glass panels that captured the sunlight. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with moisture, the perfect environment for the Colonel's prized orchids. Guests wandered among the exotic blooms, exclaiming over their beauty and rarity. Miss Marple paused by a particularly delicate specimen, admiring its pale pink petals, when a sharp cry from the back of the greenhouse caused her to straighten abruptly. "Father, father, come quickly!" It was James Pettigrew's voice, high with alarm. The crowd parted as Colonel Pettigrew hurried toward his son, who stood pale-faced beside an overturned terracotta pot. But it wasn't the broken pottery that had caused the commotion. There, half buried in the rich, dark soil, was a human hand, unmistakably female, with a distinctive emerald ring still glittering on one slender finger. "Good heavens!" whispered Florence Pettigrew, her composure finally cracking as she swayed on her feet. "That's Eliza's ring." "Eliza?" Inspector Craddock asked sharply, professional instincts taking over as he moved forward to take control of the situation. "Who is Eliza?" It was Miss Marple who answered, her gentle voice carrying in the suddenly silent greenhouse. "Eliza Montague, the Colonel's ward who supposedly ran away to London 15 years ago." Her pale blue eyes met the Colonel's shocked gaze, but it appears she never left St. Mary Mead after all. Chapter 2. Whispers. Among the Rose Bushes. The discovery in the greenhouse had transformed the genteel garden party into a scene of barely contained chaos. Inspector Craddock had quickly taken charge, asking all guests to remain on the premises while constables were summoned from the nearby town. The greenhouse was promptly sealed off, a young policeman stationed at its entrance with instructions to allow no one inside. Miss Marple sat quietly on a wrought-iron garden bench beneath a pergola draped with climbing roses. From this vantage point, she could observe the various groups that had formed across the lawn, their animated conversations carrying on the summer breeze. The village was already dissecting the shocking revelation, memories being dusted off and re-examined in light of this new evidence. 15 years, Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife, whispered to her small circle of confidants. All this time, right under our noses. I always said there was something suspicious about her disappearance." "You said nothing of the sort, Millicent," corrected Mrs. Price Ridley, adjusting her hat with indignation. I distinctly recall you agreeing with everyone else that the girl had simply grown tired of country life. Young people rarely stay in villages these days. Well, I may not have expressed it, but I certainly thought it," Mrs. Bantry replied defensively. "The Colonel was devastated when she left without so much as a goodbye. And that letter they supposedly found afterward always seemed rather convenient, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on a tiny pink booty destined for her newest grandniece. Her expression remained placid, but her mind was cataloguing everything she heard, sorting the useful facts from mere speculation. "Excuse me, Miss Marple." The soft voice belonged to Diana Carmichael, who approached with careful steps, her bright red dress a splash of colour against the greenery. "May I join you? Everyone else seems to be, well, rather caught up in their gossip." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, shifting slightly to make room on the bench. "A dreadful business. Particularly difficult for newcomers like yourself and the Professor." Diana's perfectly manicured fingers twisted the pearl necklace at her throat. "Victor is distressed. He and the Colonel were colleagues once, you know, at Cambridge, before the war. They had a falling out in India. Something to do with research that Victor never speaks about." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Old grudges can run very deep. Reminds me of the Simmons sisters in the village, where my aunt lived. A disagreement over a piece of furniture that divided them for 30 years. Diana gave her a curious look, uncertain how to respond to this seemingly irrelevant anecdote. Before she could speak again, Inspector Craddock approached, his notebook in hand. "Mrs. Carmichael, I wonder if I might have a word. Just routine questions for all guests, you understand." Diana rose gracefully, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "Of course, Inspector, though I can't imagine how I could possibly help. We've only lived here for 3 months." "Sometimes a fresh perspective is invaluable," Craddock replied, escorting her toward the house where he had set up a temporary interview space in the Colonel's study. As they departed, Miss Marple observed Florence Pettigrew standing alone by a clump of delphiniums, her earlier composure now completely shattered. Her hands shook as she attempted to light a cigarette, the match flaring and dying 3 times before James appeared at her side, taking the matchbox from her with a sharp word that made her flinch. Across the lawn, Colonel Pettigrew sat rigidly, in a garden chair, his military bearing more pronounced than ever, as if only strict discipline could keep him from collapse. The village doctor, Dr. Haydock, hovered nearby, occasionally checking the old man's pulse and offering what appeared to be unwelcome reassurances. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Howard Blackwood, the solicitor, who was engaged in a heated, whispered exchange with the Pettigrew's gardener, a wiry man named Simmons, whose family had tended the Elderflower Lodge grounds for generations. The 2 men stood partly concealed behind a large rhododendron, but their agitated gestures suggested a disagreement of some significance. "Quite a commotion, isn't it?" The elderly voice at her side belonged to Miss Weatherby, a retired school teacher and one of Miss Marple's circle of friends. "To think we all believed she'd run off to pursue a stage career in London. Such a pretty girl, Eliza was. Spirited too, always challenging the Colonel's strict rules." "Indeed, Miss Marple," agreed, her needles never faltering. I remember her quite clearly. A great beauty with those unusual green eyes. The emerald ring suited her. A gift from the Colonel on her 18th birthday, I believe. Just so, nodded Miss Weatherby. He treated her like a daughter after her parents died in that terrible accident. Took her in when she was only 10. Some said it was guilt, of course. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Guilt? Oh, surely you recall. Her father was the Colonel's adjutant in the regiment. There was some scandal about funds going missing, and the poor man shot himself rather than face court-martial. His wife took an overdose of sleeping pills the same night. The Colonel always maintained the man's innocence, said he'd been framed. That's why he took Eliza in, felt responsible. From the driveway came the sound of more police vehicles arriving. The constables began to string rope around the perimeter of the greenhouse, transforming the festive garden into a crime scene. Miss Marple watched as James Pettigrew broke away from his wife and approached Inspector Craddock, his face set in lines of grim determination. The two men conferred briefly before walking together toward the house, James gesturing emphatically as if making a point of great importance. "I suppose they'll want to dig up the entire greenhouse now," Miss Weatherby sighed. "Those prize orchids will never survive being transplanted in such haste. The Colonel will be devastated. They were his life after Eliza left. Or didn't leave, as it turns out." Miss Marple carefully counted her stitches before responding. People often become quite passionate about their hobbies after a tragedy. A distraction from uncomfortable thoughts. "You know," Miss Weatherby leaned closer, lowering her voice, "I always wondered about Florence. She arrived in the village just 6 months after Eliza disappeared. The Colonel introduced her to James at the Christmas party that year, and they were married by spring. Awfully quick, wouldn't you say?" Before Miss Marple could reply, a commotion near the house drew their attention. Professor Carmichael was arguing vehemently with a police constable, who appeared to be preventing him from leaving the premises. "This is preposterous," the professor's cultured voice carried across the lawn. "My wife and I arrived in this village only recently. We cannot possibly have any connection to events that occurred 15 years ago." The constable remained unmoved. "Inspector's orders, sir. No one leaves until questioned." Professor Carmichael turned, seeking his wife, and spotted her through the study window with Inspector Craddock. The colour drained from his face, and he took an involuntary step toward the house before catching himself and retreating to a solitary bench at the edge of the lawn. Miss Marple observed this reaction with interest, her blue eyes sharpening. She carefully placed her knitting in her bag and rose to her feet. "I think," she said to Miss Weatherby, "I might just take a little stroll around the perimeter of the garden. One gets so stiff sitting too long at my age." As she walked slowly along the hedge-bordered path, Miss Marple's thoughts were not on the beauty of the summer flowers, but on a winter evening 15 years ago, and a young girl with emerald eyes, who had supposedly chosen freedom, but had instead found a most permanent imprisonment in the soil of Colonel Pettigrew's beloved greenhouse. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Suspicion. Inspector Craddock sat behind the imposing mahogany desk in Colonel Pettigrew's study, reviewing his preliminary notes. The room reflected its owner's military precision. Leather-bound books arranged by height, silver-framed photographs of regimental gatherings positioned at exact intervals, and a collection of Indian artifacts displayed in a glass-fronted cabinet, each item labelled in meticulous handwriting. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Mills, a local officer with a ruddy complexion and practical manner, entered with a folder. "Medical examiner's initial report, sir," Mills announced, placing the folder before Craddock. "Dr. Haydock says he can't be precise about time of death until the remains are properly examined, but he's certain the body has been there for many years, consistent with the 15-year time frame mentioned." Craddock nodded grimly. "And the identity?" "The ring seems to confirm it's Eliza Montague, sir. Plus, according to village records, no other young women went missing from St. Mary Mead during that period. The Chief Constable has authorised a full excavation of the greenhouse area tomorrow morning." "Good," Craddock replied, glancing at his watch. "Most of the guests have been interviewed and released, but I've asked the Pettigrew family and the Carmichaels to remain. There's something about the Professor's reaction that doesn't sit right with me." As Mills departed, Craddock flipped through his notes again. The story of Eliza Montague's supposed flight to London had been remarkably consistent across all accounts. A spirited young woman, chafing under the Colonel's strict guardianship, who had left a brief note explaining her desire to pursue a stage career. No one had actually seen her leave, but a station porter in the next village recalled driving her to the train station in the early hours of a February morning 15 years ago. Or at least he recalled driving a young woman matching her description. Soft tap at the open door drew his attention. Miss Marple stood there, her expression apologetic. "I wonder, Inspector, if I might trouble you for a moment. I believe I may have some information that could be of use." Craddock gestured to the chair opposite. He had worked with Miss Marple on a previous case and had learned to value her insights, unconventional as her methods might seem. "I was just thinking about poor Eliza," Miss Marple began, settling her knitting bag beside her. "Such a tragedy. It reminded me of something that occurred at Lady Mountjoy's estate when I was a girl. A similar disappearance that turned out to be quite different from initial appearances." Craddock nodded encouragingly, familiar with Miss Marple's roundabout way of making a point. "The curious thing about Eliza's disappearance," she continued, "was the timing. February 15th, if I recall correctly, the day after Valentine's Day, and there was a rather significant event at Elderflower Lodge that same evening." "What event was that, Miss Marple?" "A dinner party, quite exclusive, only 6 guests. The Colonel, James, and 4 others, including Professor Carmichael and his first wife, Charlotte. I remember because my nephew Raymond was visiting, and we happened to walk past Elderflower Lodge that evening. The Professor's car was quite distinctive, a Bentley with a damaged headlamp." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "The Professor was here the night before Eliza disappeared." "Indeed. And what struck me as odd was that when the Carmichaels arrived in the village 3 months ago, the Professor claimed he hadn't seen the Colonel since their time in India. Yet here he was, dining at Elderflower Lodge 15 years ago, outside. In the garden, the remaining guests had gathered in small groups, watching as police technicians carefully cordoned off the area around the greenhouse. Florence Pettigrew, her earlier composure now restored through what appeared to be several glasses of sherry, was engaged in animated conversation with Howard Blackwood, the solicitor. Their heads were close together, their expressions intent. James Pettigrew stood apart, smoking furiously, one cigarette after another. His gaze repeatedly drifted toward the greenhouse, his expression unreadable. When one of the constables emerged carrying a sealed evidence bag, James abruptly turned away, crushing his half-finished cigarette beneath his heel. The Carmichaels presented a study in contrast. Diana paced to the edge of the lawn, her red dress vivid against the greenery, while the professor remained seated on a bench, rigidly upright, his academic's face set in lines of controlled displeasure. "Were you acquainted with Eliza Montague, Miss Marple?" Craddock asked, returning his attention to the elderly lady. "Not intimately, no. She attended our church fundraisers occasionally, though the Colonel preferred to keep her somewhat isolated." Miss Marple's fingers worked steadily at her knitting as she spoke. "She was strikingly beautiful, the sort of beauty that causes disturbances in a small community. There was an incident at the village dance shortly before her disappearance. James had danced with her rather more than was appropriate, considering she was his father's ward. Florence, who wasn't Florence Pettigrew then, but Florence Hartley, visiting from London, made quite a scene." Craddock leaned forward. "Florence knew James before Eliza disappeared?" "Oh, yes." Miss Marple nodded. "She was a frequent visitor to Elderflower Lodge that winter. The Colonel had engaged her to catalogue his collection of Indian artefacts. She had some expertise in the field, having worked at the British Museum. There were rumours, of course, about her real interest being James rather than antiques." Commotion from the hallway interrupted their conversation. Colonel Pettigrew's authoritative voice, though strained, carried clearly through the partially open door. "This is preposterous. I've answered your questions, Sergeant, and I've had quite enough. This is still my home, and I insist that you conclude your business here promptly." Craddock sighed and rose from his seat. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, it seems the Colonel's patience is wearing thin. Of course, Inspector, just one more thing that might interest you." Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting. "The greenhouse renovation that the Colonel mentioned today. It isn't the first time such work has been planned. 15 years ago, immediately after Eliza's disappearance, the Colonel announced similar renovations. They were scheduled to begin the very week after she left. However, they were abruptly cancelled when a rare orchid specimen developed some sort of disease that required immediate attention. The greenhouse was quarantined for months. No gardeners allowed except for Simmons, who lived in the cottage on the grounds." Craddock's expression sharpened with interest. "And you're certain of this timeline?" "Quite certain, Inspector. My memory for such details is rather reliable. My friend Miss Weatherby kept a diary during that period. She was most disappointed when the greenhouse was closed to visitors, as she had been painting watercolours of the Colonel's orchids for a local exhibition." As Miss Marple departed, Craddock made several rapid notes in his book. Through the study window, he could see the Colonel now standing near a magnificent oak tree, deep in conversation with Professor Carmichael. The two elderly men appeared to be arguing, their gestures restrained but emphatic. Diana Carmichael had ceased her pacing, and now stood watching her husband from a distance, her expression wary. When James Pettigrew approached her, offering a cigarette, she accepted with visible relief. Their brief exchange seemed charged with an undercurrent that Craddock couldn't quite define from this distance. He turned his attention back to his notes, adding Miss Marple's information about the cancelled greenhouse renovations. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Planned renovations 15 years ago, abandoned after Eliza's disappearance, and now new renovations revealing her body. But why would the Colonel, if involved in her death, risk exposing the grave now? Unless, Craddock thought grimly, he had believed the remains would no longer be there. The question that now dominated his mind was not just who had killed Eliza, Montague, but who had thought her body would never be found, even when the soil that concealed her was finally disturbed. Chapter 4. A Familiar Pattern. The morning after the garden party dawned with an oppressive mugginess that promised rain by afternoon. Miss Marple rose at her usual early hour, tending to her own modest garden before the heat became unbearable. As she carefully deadheaded her prize roses, her thoughts remained fixed on the events at Elderflower Lodge. The telephone rang just as she was removing her gardening gloves. It was her friend Dolly Bantry, breathless with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess what's happening at Elderflower Lodge this very moment. They're digging up the entire greenhouse. 3 police cars and a van from the forensic laboratory in London. Dr. Haydock is there too, and they've set up a tent over the area where— well, you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I expected they would begin early. Inspector, Craddock strikes me as very thorough. The village is simply buzzing. Mrs. Price Ridley has invited a group for coffee to discuss the matter. She's quite determined that James Pettigrew must be guilty. Says he was infatuated with Eliza and killed her in a fit of jealousy when she planned to run away." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she found the theory anything but. "And what was James jealous of, precisely?" "Well," Dolly hesitated, "that's not entirely clear. But Mrs. Price Ridley says there was a young man from the neighbouring village who was sweet on Eliza. A gardener's assistant who worked at Elderflower Lodge briefly. Tom something or other. He left the area right around the same time Eliza disappeared." After concluding the call, Miss Marple changed into a neat blue dress and prepared to walk into the village. She had just picked up her basket when another ring at the telephone interrupted. "Her departure, Miss Marple?" Inspector Craddock's voice sounded strained. "I wonder if you might be available for a brief conversation. I find myself in need of your particular perspective." Half an hour later, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room of Elderflower Lodge with Inspector Craddock, well away from the activity at the greenhouse. The elegant room was unnaturally quiet, the usual household sounds muffled by the weight of recent events. "We've found the rest of the remains," Craddock said without preamble. "Dr. Haydock confirms they've been there approximately 15 years. Cause of death appears to be a severe blow to the back of the skull." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "The poor child. Has the Colonel been informed?" "Yes. He's taken the news remarkably calmly, almost as if he expected it. James, on the other hand, became quite agitated and had to be sedated by Dr. Haydock. Florence is with him now." "And the Professor?" "I understand he and his wife were asked to remain in the village." Craddock's eyebrows rose slightly. "You are well informed, Miss Marple. Yes, the Carmichaels are staying at the Blue Boar Inn. The Professor claims he barely remembers Eliza, despite having dined here the night before her disappearance." He hesitated before continuing. "There's something else. We found a second item, buried with the body, a man's pocket watch. Gold, with initials engraved on the back, V.C. Victor Carmichael, Miss Marple said softly. Precisely. When confronted, the professor claimed the watch had been stolen during his visit 15 years ago. He reported the theft to the colonel, but not to the police, as he didn't wish to cast suspicion on the household staff. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Florence Pettigrew walking slowly across the lawn, her arms wrapped around herself. Despite the warmth of the day, she paused beneath a copper beech tree, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. Florence seems most distressed, Miss Marple observed, though I wonder if it's concern for her husband or anxiety about what might be revealed. She was quite familiar with Elderflower Lodge before becoming its mistress. Yes, you mentioned that yesterday. We've confirmed she was cataloguing the Colonel's collection during that period. Craddock flipped through his notebook. The Colonel speaks highly of her expertise, though he was surprisingly vague about exactly who recommended her for the task. At that moment, the drawing-room door opened to admit Howard Blackwood, the solicitor. He appeared startled to find the room occupied. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I beg your pardon. I was told the Colonel wished to see me here." "He's speaking with the Chief Constable in his study," Craddock replied. "They should be finished shortly," Sid nodded stiffly and turned to leave, but Craddock's voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood, while you're here, you were the Pettigrew family solicitor 15 years ago, were you not?" "I was," Blackwood confirmed, his tone cautious. "My father handled their affairs before me, and his father before him." "Then you would have been familiar with Eliza Montague's legal status in the household?" The solicitor's expression became guarded. Miss Montague was the Colonel's ward. He had full legal guardianship until her 21st birthday, at which point she would have come into a modest inheritance from her parents. Nothing substantial, but enough to establish her independence. "And when would she have turned 21? Miss Marple inquired gently. Blackwood hesitated, his fingers tapping against his leather briefcase. "As it happens, the week after she disappeared, February 23rd would have been her birthday." A significant look passed between Craddock and Miss Marple. "One more question, if you don't mind," the inspector said. "Was there any provision in the Colonel's will regarding Miss Montague?" "That would be confidential information," Blackwood replied primly. "However, I can state that following Miss Montague's departure, the Colonel did revise his will. The general assumption was that he had removed her from it." After the solicitor departed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple with raised eyebrows. "That adds a rather compelling motive, wouldn't you say? If Eliza stood to inherit on her 21st birthday." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I find myself wondering about something else entirely. Mrs. Bantry mentioned this morning that a young gardener's assistant left the area around the same time as Eliza. Tom, I believe his name was. Thomas Wright." Craddock nodded. "We've already begun inquiries." He worked at Elderflower Lodge for approximately 6 months and departed without notice 2 days after Eliza's disappearance. The Colonel assumed he had followed her to London. "How convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "Young people do form attachments, of course. My grandniece met her husband when he was delivering groceries to her boarding house. But it seems rather too tidy, doesn't it?" Through the window, they observed Diana Carmichael arriving at the front gate of Elderflower Lodge. her fashionable dress and hat contrasting sharply with the sombre atmosphere. She appeared to be arguing with the constable, stationed there, her gestures becoming increasingly agitated. "Mrs. Carmichael seems quite determined to gain entry," Craddock noted, rising from his chair. "I'd better see what's so urgent." Left alone, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the framed photographs arranged on a nearby table. They documented the Colonel's military career and family life in chronological sequence, his wedding, James as a child, regimental gatherings, and finally a single photograph of Eliza Montague. The girl's striking beauty was evident even in the formal portrait, her emerald eyes seeming to challenge the viewer. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was not Eliza's face, but a barely discernible detail in the background. A blurred figure standing in a doorway, watching. Though indistinct, something about the posture and attitude struck her as oddly familiar. A sudden commotion outside drew her to the window. Diana Carmichael had somehow evaded the constable and was now hurrying across the lawn toward the greenhouse, where the forensic team continued their meticulous work. Inspector Craddock pursued her, calling for her to stop. When she ignored him, he signalled to two officers who moved to intercept her. Diana came to an abrupt halt, not because of the approaching officers, but because Florence Pettigrew had stepped directly into her path. The two women stood face to face, Florence's expression coldly furious, Diana's desperate. Words were exchanged, too distant for Miss Marple to hear, but their body language spoke volumes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed in concentration. The tableau before her stirred a memory, not of St. Mary Mead, but of a scene she had witnessed years ago in a London park, when two women had confronted each other over a man's deception. The pattern was so familiar, yet something about this case refused to fit the expected mould. As she watched Florence and Diana being escorted back toward the house by Craddock, Miss Marple reached a decision. There was someone she needed to speak with, someone whose perspective might shed light on the events of 15 years ago from an angle the police would never consider. It was time to pay a visit to Simmons, the gardener who had tended the greenhouse when Eliza Montague was buried beneath its fertile soil. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The gardener's cottage at Elderflower Lodge stood at the far edge of the estate, partially concealed by a stand of ancient yew trees. It was a modest structure of weathered stone, with a slate roof and climbing roses framing. The door, picturesque enough for a postcard, Miss Marple thought as she made her way along the narrow path that skirted the main grounds. She had deliberately chosen this route to avoid the police activity still centred around the greenhouse. A light drizzle had begun, turning the summer air heavy with the scent of wet earth and flowers. Miss Marple adjusted her mackintosh and continued steadily onward, her sensible shoes navigating the increasingly muddy path with practised ease. Harold Simmons answered her knock promptly, his weather-beaten face registering surprise at the sight of his visitor. "Miss Marple, whatever brings you out in this weather?" "Good morning, Mr. Simmons. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment of your time, and perhaps shelter from this rain." The gardener ushered her into the cottage's small sitting room, clearing a stack of seed catalogues from a chair. Forgive the mess. Not accustomed to visitors, especially not ladies. The interior was unexpectedly neat for a bachelor's dwelling, with carefully tended houseplants occupying every windowsill. A collection of botanical prints hung on one wall, while shelves lined with books on horticulture occupied another. Miss Marple noted the worn Bible on the side table, a pressed flower marking a page. "Terrible business up at the big house," Simmons commented, putting a kettle on the small stove. "Police crawling everywhere, digging up half my plantings. 15 years I've tended those orchids, and now they're hauling them out like weeds." "You must be quite an expert on orchids after so long," Miss Marple observed mildly, accepting the cup of tea he offered. "I understand they're particularly sensitive to soil conditions." Simmons nodded, professional pride momentarily overriding his discomfort. "Most temperamental plants in creation. That's why the Colonel trusts no one else with them. Not since old Roberts retired." A shadow crossed his face. "And now they've found Miss Eliza there. Can hardly credit it, though I suppose it explains things." "What things, Mr. Simmons?" The gardener shifted uneasily in his chair. "The greenhouse. After Miss Eliza supposedly left, the Colonel became obsessive about it. Wouldn't let anyone in but me for nearly 6 months. Said there was a rare fungus affecting the orchids that might spread to other plants." He shook his head slowly. "I thought it strange at the time. Never saw any fungus myself. But the Colonel was insistent." "And during that period, was the soil in the greenhouse ever disturbed?" Simmons's weathered hands tightened around his teacup. "As a matter of fact, it was. The Colonel had me lay a new brick path through the centre section and replace all the soil in that area. Said the fungus had contaminated it beyond saving." He paused, eyes distant with memory. "Now, I think on it, that would be right where they found her." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you ever notice anything unusual while working there during that time? Any item that seemed out of place, perhaps?" The gardener's gaze slid away from hers. "Can't say as I did, no. I see." Miss Marple set down her cup deliberately. "Mr. Simmons, I've always believed that gardeners observe far more than people give them credit for. Like postmen and housemaids, they move through the world somewhat invisibly, witnessing things others miss." A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece and the steady patter of rain against the windows. Finally, Simmons rose and crossed to a small bureau in the corner. From the bottom drawer, he withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "Found this," he said quietly, unwrapping the handkerchief to reveal a slender gold chain with a small pendant. "The day after Miss Eliza supposedly left. It was caught on one of the orchid pots. Would have scraped the new shoots if I hadn't spotted it." Miss Marple examined the pendant carefully. A delicate oval of jade, intricately carved with an Eastern design. "The Colonel gave it to her for Christmas that last year," Simmons continued. "Miss Eliza wore it constant. That's why I never believed she'd run off voluntarily. She wouldn't have left this behind. But when I tried to tell the Colonel, he—" The gardener's voice faltered. "He became quite angry. Said I was mistaken, that the necklace must belong to someone else. Ordered me never to mention it again." "And you've kept it all these years?" Simmons nodded, a flush rising to his weathered cheeks. Didn't seem right to get rid of it. Thought someday there might be questions. And now there are. Miss Marple wrapped the necklace carefully in her own handkerchief. "I believe Inspector Craddock would find this most enlightening, Mr. Simmons. Would you permit me to take it to him?" Back at Elderflower Lodge, the police presence had increased. 2 additional vehicles had arrived, and officers moved purposefully between the house and greenhouse. As Miss Marple approached the front entrance, she observed Diana Carmichael being escorted to a police car, her elegant composure now completely shattered. The professor followed immediately behind, his face set in rigid lines, ignoring the questions called out by Inspector Craddock. Inside, the atmosphere was equally tense. Miss Marple found Florence Pettigrew alone in the drawing-room, a cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers as she stared unseeing at a large oil painting above the fireplace, a military scene depicting the Colonel's regiment in India. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Miss Marple greeted her softly, "I hope I'm not intruding." Florence started violently, dropping ash onto the antique carpet. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. The police are with James and the Colonel in the study. Something about arresting the Carmichaels." She attempted a smile that emerged as more of a grimace. It seems the professor had some explaining to do about his watch being found with Eliza. "How distressing for everyone," Miss Marple commented, settling into a chair opposite Florence, "though I imagine it brings a certain relief as well, having a clear suspect after so much uncertainty." Florence's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Relief? Is that what you call it when your entire life is being excavated like that wretched greenhouse? 15 years I've been mistress of this house, Miss Marple. 15 years of managing the Colonel's affairs, supporting James through his difficulties, maintaining our position in the community. And now this scandal that has nothing to do with me threatens to destroy everything." "Nothing to do with you?" Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her pale blue eyes were sharp. "Yet I understand you were quite well acquainted with Elderflower Lodge before becoming its mistress. You were cataloguing the Colonel's collection, I believe?" Florence's hand trembled as she stubbed out her cigarette. "A professional engagement, nothing more. I had specialized in Asian artifacts at the museum. Such as this, perhaps." Miss Marple withdrew Simmons's handkerchief from her bag and carefully unfolded it, revealing the jade pendant. The colour drained from Florence's face. "Where did you get that?" "It was found in the greenhouse the day after Eliza disappeared. Curious that she would leave behind something so precious if she was indeed running away voluntarily." Florence reached for the pendant with unsteady fingers, but Miss Marple gently rewrapped it. "I believe this should go to Inspector Craddock, don't you?" A new voice spoke from the doorway. "Indeed it should, Miss Marple." Inspector Craddock entered, followed by Sergeant Mills. "And I'd be most interested to hear where you obtained it." As Miss Marple explained her visit to Simmons, Florence sat rigid in her chair, her composure crumbling visibly with each word. When the inspector turned to her for comment, she pressed her hands to her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "None of it. Eliza was leaving, truly leaving. She had a train ticket and everything. The necklace must have broken accidentally. Yet her body was found buried in the greenhouse," Craddock pointed out. "Hardly consistent with a voluntary departure." "The professor," Florence said desperately. "You've arrested him, haven't you? His watch was there. He had dinner here that night. He argued with Eliza. Everyone heard them." "What were they arguing about, Mrs. Pettigrew?" Miss Marple inquired softly. Florence's eyes darted around the room like those of a trapped animal. How should I know? I was busy with the catalogue work. James might remember. He was always hovering around Eliza. Craddock exchanged a significant look with Miss Marple. Interestingly, Professor Carmichael has just provided us with a rather different version of events that evening. He claims he saw you following Eliza to the greenhouse after dinner. He assumed you were continuing an earlier disagreement regarding your attention to James Pettigrew. That's absurd, Florence protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Victor Carmichael is trying to save himself by casting suspicion on others. His watch was found with the body. A watch he reported stolen that very night, Craddock countered, a fact the Colonel has reluctantly confirmed. At that moment, the study door opened further down the hallway, and raised voices became audible. James Pettigrew emerged, his face contorted with fury, the Colonel following with uncharacteristic hesitation in his step. "You knew!" James shouted, oblivious to his audience. "All these years, you knew she never left. You let me believe—" He broke off abruptly, noticing the group in the drawing room, his wild gaze fixed on Florence, then dropped to the handkerchief in Miss Marple's hands. "What's that?" Without waiting for an answer, he strode forward and snatched the bundle, unwrapping it with trembling fingers. At the sight of the jade pendant, all colour drained from his face. "Where did you find this?" he whispered, looking from Miss Marple to Craddock. "Mr. Simmons discovered it in the greenhouse the day after Eliza allegedly departed," Miss Marple explained gently. "He felt it significant, as Eliza was reportedly very attached to it." James closed his eyes briefly, his fingers closing convulsively around the pendant. When he spoke again, his voice was eerily calm. "She was. It was the last gift my father gave her before everything changed." "Changed how, Mr. Pettigrew?" Craddock prompted. James looked directly at the Colonel, who had remained frozen in the doorway. "Why don't you tell them, Father? Tell them why Eliza was really leaving. Tell them what was in that letter from Cambridge that arrived the day before she disappeared." Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. A heavy silence fell over the drawing-room at James's accusation. The Colonel stood perfectly still, his military bearing more pronounced than ever, only the slight tremor in his hand betraying his inner turmoil. "This is hardly the appropriate time or place, James," he said finally, his voice steady but strained. "Inspector Craddock is conducting an official investigation. Personal matters should remain." "Personal?" James's laugh held no humour. "A young woman is dead, buried in our greenhouse for 15 years, and you call it personal? Tell them about the letter, Father. Tell them why Eliza was really leaving." Florence rose unsteadily from her chair, her eyes darting between father and son. "James, please. You're upset. We all are. Perhaps we should—" "Be quiet, Florence," James snapped, his knuckles white around the jade pendant. "You've done enough damage with your lies." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his manner calm but authoritative. "Mr. Pettigrew, if you have information relevant to this investigation, I must insist you share it." James turned to face the inspector, though his words seemed directed at his father. "The day before Eliza disappeared, a letter arrived from Cambridge University. It was addressed to her, but Father opened it, as he did all her correspondence. It was an acceptance letter. She'd applied secretly, using her mother's maiden name, and had been granted both admission and a scholarship. Miss Marple nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if a suspicion had been confirmed. Eliza was an intelligent young woman, I believe, quite scholarly. Brilliant, James affirmed, his expression softening momentarily. She'd been teaching herself from father's library for years. Languages, mathematics, history. She absorbed everything. But father refused to consider higher education for her, said it wasn't appropriate for a young woman of her position. The colonel moved into the room at last, his face ashen. I was protecting her. The academic world would have crushed her spirit, filled her head with inappropriate notions. As her guardian, it was my duty to guide her toward a suitable future. As her jailer, you mean? James retorted bitterly. You kept her isolated here, controlling every aspect of her life. When that letter came, she finally found the courage to stand. Up to you. I heard your argument that night. She told you she was leaving regardless of your permission, that she'd be 21 in a week, and legally free of your guardianship. Miss Marple turned to the colonel, her gentle voice belying the sharpness of her question. Is that why you invited the Carmichaels to dinner that evening, Colonel? Because you knew about Professor Carmichael's connection to Cambridge? All eyes turned to the elderly lady. The colonel's already pale face blanched further. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Craddock asked. Merely that it seems a curious coincidence. Professor Carmichael was on the admissions committee at Cambridge 15 years ago, a fact I recalled when his name first came up. His specialty was Asian antiquities, which explains both his connection to the colonel from their time in India and his presence at a dinner where Florence was presenting her catalogue of the colonel's collection. Florence sank back into her chair, hands trembling as she reached for another cigarette. This is absurd. I hardly knew Victor Carmichael before that evening. The colonel invited several guests with expertise in Asian artifacts to view the collection. It was purely professional, yet the professor claims he saw you following Eliza to the greenhouse after dinner, Craddock reminded her. Was that professional as well? He's lying, Florence insisted. Why would I follow Eliza anywhere? I barely knew the girl. James scoffed. Openly. You knew her well enough to see her as a rival. You'd been visiting for months, cultivating father's favour, positioning yourself as the perfect daughter-in-law prospect. Then suddenly there was Eliza, about to gain her independence and taking all of father's attention with her Cambridge achievement. The colonel made a sharp gesture of denial. That's quite enough, James. You're distraught and making wild accusations. It's me. I? James challenged, turning to Craddock. Inspector, have you established yet who benefits financially from Eliza's death? Craddock's gaze sharpened with interest. We know she was about to come into her inheritance upon turning 21. Modest sum from her parents, yes, James agreed. But what father never told anyone was that his own father, my grandfather, had set up a trust for Eliza as well, a substantial one. In his will, he'd specified that if anything happened to her parents, a portion of his estate should be held for their daughter until she came of age. How do you know this? The colonel demanded, his composure finally cracking. Those papers were sealed. I found them in your study 10 years ago when I was looking for the estate accounts. James replied evenly. Along with the original note, Eliza supposedly left when she ran away. The one in your handwriting, father. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The Colonel staggered slightly, reaching for the back of a chair to steady himself. Miss Marple watched this exchange with sorrowful eyes. "The money from this trust, where did it go after Eliza's disappearance, Colonel?" It was Howard Blackwood who answered, appearing suddenly in the doorway as if summoned by the question. "As the family solicitor, I can answer that. The trust reverted to the main Pettigrew estate, as stipulated in the original documents in the event of Miss Montague's death or disappearance before reaching maturity." "How convenient," Craddock observed. "And the estate is controlled by?" "The Colonel, of course," Blackwood replied. "Though a significant portion was settled on Mrs. Pettigrew upon her marriage to James." Florence's cigarette dropped from nerveless fingers as all eyes turned to her. "I knew nothing about any trust," she protested. "The Colonel was generous when James and I married, yes, but I assumed it came from the estate." "It did," the Colonel confirmed grimly. "From what would have been Eliza's portion." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of police activity from the greenhouse. Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled in her lap, her gentle face thoughtful as she observed the family. Tableau before her. "There's something I still don't understand," she said at last. "If Eliza was murdered the night of the dinner party, presumably in the greenhouse where her body was found, how did Professor Carmichael's watch come to be buried with her, particularly if he had reported it stolen that same evening?" The Colonel's shoulders sagged visibly, the military posture giving way at last to the weight of 15 years of secrets. "Because Victor Carmichael was in the greenhouse with her," he said quietly. "I saw them there together when I went looking for Eliza after our argument. They were deep in conversation, about the Cambridge admission, I presumed. I left without disturbing them. It was the last time I saw her alive. And you didn't think to mention this to the police when her body was discovered?" Craddock asked incredulously. "I believed," the Colonel faltered, "when she didn't appear at breakfast, and then the station porter reported driving a young woman to the train. I convinced myself she had indeed left as threatened. Even when Simmons tried to tell me about finding her necklace, I refused to consider the alternative. And then when we began the greenhouse renovations and found nothing amiss, because the body had been concealed elsewhere initially, moved only after the first search was complete," Miss Marple concluded softly. "Someone with intimate knowledge of the property and plenty of time to move the remains under cover of darkness. Someone who knew that Simmons was the only person who entered the greenhouse during those months of quarantine for the supposed fungus infection." James's expression hardened as realization dawned. "The gardener's assistant, Thomas Wright, the one who disappeared right after Eliza." "The timing would suggest his involvement," Craddock agreed, "though it doesn't explain how the Professor's watch ended up with the body if he had already reported it stolen earlier that evening. Unless someone deliberately placed it there," Miss Marple suggested. "Someone who knew about the theft and saw an opportunity to direct suspicion away from themselves." Florence rose suddenly, her face rigid with suppressed emotion. "I think I should call Dr. Haydock. The Colonel doesn't look well." Indeed, the elderly man had grown increasingly pale, beads of sweat visible on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. As Florence moved toward the telephone, however, Sergeant Mills appeared in the doorway. "Inspector, there's something you should see," The forensic team has found another item buried with the remains." "What is it, Mills?" Craddock asked. The sergeant held up an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small brass key. "It's a key to the Colonel's study, sir, and there are initials engraved on it, F.E.H. "Florence Hartley," James breathed, turning to stare at his wife. Florence froze, the blood draining from her face. Her eyes, wild with panic, darted toward the door as if calculating the possibility of escape. Then, with a sudden violent movement, she seized a heavy brass candlestick from the mantelpiece and swung it toward Miss Marple, who sat nearest to her. "Florence, no!" James cried, lunging forward. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Miss Marple, with surprising agility for a woman of her age, shifted sideways in her chair. The candlestick whistled past her ear, striking the delicate tea table instead and sending china shattering across the carpet. Sergeant Mills and Inspector Craddock moved simultaneously, restraining Florence as she struggled and screamed. She ruined everything. Little Miss Perfect with her scholarship, and her trust fund, and her hold over all of you. She was going to take it all. The money, the Colonel's affection, even you, James. I couldn't let her win, not after everything I'd done to secure my position here." As the officers led the still ranting Florence from the room, the Colonel slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands. James stood frozen, the jade pendant still clutched in his fist, its green stone catching the afternoon light filtering through the windows. Miss Marple surveyed the shattered teacup at her feet with mild regret. "Such a shame," she murmured. "Royal Doulton, if I'm not mistaken. Reminds me of the Bennington case, another instance where a valuable object was used to establish a false timeline." She looked up to find Inspector Craddock regarding her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You suspected Florence all along, didn't you, Miss Marple?" "I had my suspicions," she admitted. "The pattern was familiar. A young woman with prospects eliminated by someone who coveted her position, but there were still pieces missing." She glanced toward the Colonel. "And I believe there still are." Chapter 7. Another twist. The day following Florence's dramatic breakdown dawned with unexpected brightness, as if nature itself had decided that enough gloom had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the morning sunshine, while she methodically deadheaded her roses, a task that always helped clarify her thoughts. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her contemplation. It was Inspector Craddock, his voice taut with urgency. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might join me at the police station. There's been a rather significant development." Half an hour later, she was seated across from Craddock in his sparse office, a cup of indifferent tea cooling on the desk between them. "Florence Pettigrew has made a formal confession," the inspector began without preamble. "She admits to following Eliza to the greenhouse that night and confronting her about the Cambridge acceptance. According to her statement, the argument became heated, and she struck Eliza with a garden trowel in a moment of uncontrolled anger." "I see." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the Professor's watch? The key with her initials?" She claims the watch was already there on a potting bench. The Professor had removed it earlier while examining a rare orchid specimen. As for the key, she admits placing it deliberately with the body to ensure she'd have access to the Colonel's study afterward, where Eliza's acceptance letter and trust documents were kept. "A remarkably thorough confession," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Almost too thorough, one might say." Craddock leaned forward, his expression intent. "Exactly my thought, particularly in light of what we've just discovered." He slid a folder across the desk. "The forensic report came in this morning. Eliza Montague wasn't killed by a single blow to the head, as we initially thought. She was strangled first, then struck afterward, likely to disguise the true cause of death." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Strangulation suggests premeditation rather than a heated argument. Did Florence mention this?" "No," Craddock replied grimly. "She was quite specific about striking Eliza in sudden anger. Furthermore, the soil samples from beneath the body contained traces of a particular fertilizer compound that wasn't used in the greenhouse until several days after Eliza's disappearance, suggesting the body was indeed moved later, as we suspected," Miss Marple concluded, "by someone with access to the greenhouse during the supposed quarantine period. Thomas Wright," Craddock confirmed. "We've managed to trace him to a small village in Scotland. He's been living under the name Thomas Griffiths for the past 15 years, working as a groundskeeper at a private estate. Local police are bringing him in for questioning as we speak." Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully. "There's something else, isn't there, Inspector? Something that prompted this urgent meeting?" Craddock hesitated before responding. "Diana Carmichael visited Florence in her cell last night, claiming to be a distant cousin. The constable on duty didn't think to refuse her, given her social standing. What they discussed we don't know, but immediately afterward Florence requested paper and wrote out her comprehensive confession." "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "And the Professor and Mrs. Carmichael? Where are they now?" "We had to release them this morning. The watch alone wasn't sufficient evidence to hold them, and with Florence's confession—" He spread his hands in a gesture of frustration. "They've checked out of the Blue Boar Inn, saying they're returning to London, though I've arranged for them to be monitored." A gentle knock at the door preceded Sergeant Mills, who entered bearing a telegram. "Just arrived for you, sir. From Scotland." Craddock scanned the message, his expression darkening. Thomas Wright was found dead in his cottage an hour before the police arrived. Apparent suicide. He left a note confessing to helping dispose of Eliza's body after finding her already dead in the rose garden. He claims he moved her to the greenhouse days later at the instruction of— He looked up at Miss Marple. "Mrs. Diana Carmichael, then known as Diana Hartley." "Florence's sister," Miss Marple said quietly. "I had begun to suspect as much. There was something in their confrontation at Elderflower Lodge, a familiarity beneath the hostility, and in the photograph of Eliza, the blurred figure watching from the doorway had the same distinctive posture as Diana." "Sisters?" Craddock looked startled. "But they have different surnames, and there's been no indication in our background checks." "Half-sisters, I imagine," Miss Marple corrected herself. "With different fathers, but the same mother. The resemblance is subtle, more in mannerism than appearance. And they've been careful to present themselves as strangers, haven't they? Just as the Professor pretended not to have visited Elderflower Lodge before, despite having dined there the night of Eliza's death." Craddock pressed his fingers to his temples, visibly reassessing the case in light of this new information. so Diana Hartley was also present at Elderflower Lodge that night, though not as an official dinner guest. But perhaps visiting her half-sister, who was cataloguing the Colonel's collection, Miss Marple suggested, a young woman who might easily have blended into the background during a formal dinner, particularly if she made herself useful with serving or clearing. The perfect position from which to observe Eliza. And 15 years later, she returns as Diana Carmichael, the professor's wife. Craddock shook his head in disbelief. But why take such a risk? Why return to the scene of the crime? Because of the greenhouse renovations, Miss Marple replied simply. The Colonel announced them publicly at the garden party, remember? You had buried evidence of a murder, and suddenly learned the burial site was to be excavated. Wouldn't you want to be present when it was discovered? To control the narrative, perhaps? Or to ensure certain items were found and others weren't? A shadow of understanding crossed Craddock's face. That's why Diana was so desperate to reach the greenhouse yesterday. Not out of curiosity, but to retrieve or plant something before the forensic team found it. And why Florence was equally determined to stop her, Miss Marple added. Each sister protecting herself at the expense of the other. Craddock rose abruptly from his desk. I need to get officers to London immediately. If Diana Carmichael orchestrated this from the beginning— I wonder, Miss Marple interrupted gently, if you've considered the Colonel's role in all this. He claims to have seen Eliza speaking with the professor in the greenhouse, yet never mentioned this until confronted. He created the elaborate story about a fungus infection to restrict access after her disappearance. And according to James, he forged the note explaining her supposed departure. You think he was involved in her death? Craddock asked, pausing. In his preparations? Not directly, perhaps, but complicit in its concealment, certainly. Miss Marple's expression grew troubled. There's still the matter of the Cambridge letter. If Eliza's academic acceptance so disturbed him that he opened her correspondence and opposed her plans, might he not have taken more decisive action to prevent her departure? Such as enlisting Florence or Diana to dissuade her by any means necessary, Craddock suggested grimly. And then finding himself facing unexpected consequences, Miss Marple agreed. The Colonel is a man accustomed to control, Inspector. When faced with scandal, his instinct would be to contain it, just as he contained Eliza's remains within his greenhouse where he could monitor them. All these years, tending those orchids directly above her grave. There's something almost ritualistic about it, wouldn't you say? Before Craddock could respond, the telephone on his desk rang sharply. His expression grew increasingly grave as he listened to the caller, offering only brief acknowledgments before hanging up. It seems events are moving more quickly than anticipated, he told Miss Marple. The London police have located the Carmichaels' hotel, but they're too late. The couple checked out barely an hour after arriving, leaving most of their belongings behind. And there's more. James Pettigrew has disappeared from Elderflower Lodge. The constable stationed there reports that the Colonel's condition has deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Haydock has been summoned. James is pursuing them, Miss Marple said, with certainty. He's realized the full extent of the deception. Not just his father's role in covering up Eliza's death, but Florence's collaboration with her sister. The pendant was the key, you see. He recognized its significance immediately. We need to find all three of them before this spirals further out of control, Craddock said, reaching for his hat. "Where would the Carmichaels go, Miss Marple? If they've abandoned their belongings and normal travel plans?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully, her knitting needles momentarily still in her lap. "If I were Diana Carmichael, fleeing with evidence of my involvement in a 15-year-old murder about to be discovered, I would seek the one place where I could still control the narrative." She looked up at Craddock, her gentle eyes suddenly sharp with certainty. "They've gone back to Elderflower Lodge, Inspector. Back to where it all began." As Craddock hurried from the office, issuing rapid instructions to Sergeant Mills, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression thoughtful. The case had followed a pattern she recognized from human nature. Secrets begetting secrets. Deception leading to further deception, until the weight of years made the truth almost impossible to untangle. Almost, but not quite, for at the heart of this web of lies and misdirection was a simple, terrible truth. Eliza Montague had died because she dared to claim her independence. And someone at Elderflower Lodge had decided that her future, her very life, was a price worth paying to maintain control. Miss Marple gathered her belongings and rose slowly from her chair. There was one more piece of the puzzle she needed to examine, a perspective that everyone, even Inspector Craddock, had overlooked. It was time to speak with Charlotte Carmichael, the Professor's first wife, who had also been present at that fateful dinner 15 years ago, and who might hold the final key to understanding what truly happened the night Eliza Montague met her death. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Miss Marple's taxi arrived at the gates of Elderflower Lodge just as dark clouds began to gather overhead, casting premature shadows across the once immaculate gardens. The police presence had diminished considerably since the previous day. Only a single constable remained stationed at the entrance, looking rather forlorn, as raindrops began to spatter his uniform. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted her, touching his helmet respectfully. "Inspector Craddock mentioned you might be coming by. Quite the commotion inside. The Colonel's taken a turn for the worse, and Dr. Haydock's with him now." "Thank you, Constable," Miss Marple replied, noting with interest the tire tracks in the freshly dampened gravel. 2 distinct sets, one leading in and another out, both recent. "Has anyone else arrived in the last hour or so?" "Just Dr. Haydock, miss. Though I did see Mr. James earlier. Drove off in an awful hurry about 2 hours ago. Barely acknowledged me as he passed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and made her way up the curving drive, her sensible umbrella unfurled against the increasing rain. The grand house loomed ahead, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. Yet it was not toward the main entrance that Miss Marple directed her steps, but rather around the side path that led to the greenhouse. The police tape still cordoned off the area, though the forensic team had completed their work. Through the glass panels, she could see that many of the Colonel's prized orchids had been removed or disturbed, their pots standing empty on the tiered shelves. The central area, where Eliza's remains had been discovered, was now a raw, excavated pit. As Miss Marple stood contemplating this scene, a flicker of movement within the greenhouse caught her attention. Someone was inside, moving among the remaining plants with a familiarity that suggested intimate knowledge of the space. Careful to remain partially concealed behind a large rhododendron, Miss Marple observed as the figure, a woman in elegant attire, knelt beside the excavated area, fingers probing delicately into the soil at its edge. Diana Carmichael had returned, just as Miss Marple had predicted, and she was searching for something with desperate urgency. After a moment's consideration, Miss Marple stepped into view, approaching the greenhouse with deliberate footsteps that crunched on the gravel path. Diana's head snapped up at the sound, her composed beauty briefly distorted by an expression of alarm, before she smoothed her features into a mask of polite surprise. "Miss Marple," she called, emerging from the greenhouse with an air of casual innocence, brushing soil from her hands. "What a coincidence! I've just returned to collect some personal items we left behind in our hasty departure." "In the greenhouse, Mrs. Carmichael?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "How curious. I wouldn't have thought you had any personal belongings among the Colonel's orchids." Diana's laugh held a brittle edge. "Simply curiosity, I assure you. Such a tragedy about poor Eliza. The Professor and I were discussing it on our drive back to London, and realized we never had a proper look at where she was found." "A 15-year-old mystery does exert a certain fascination," Miss Marple agreed, stepping closer until she stood just outside the greenhouse door, "particularly when one has a personal connection to it." Something flickered in Diana's eyes, a momentary calculation quickly hidden. Personal connection? I hardly knew the girl. As I've explained repeatedly to that persistent inspector, the Professor and I only moved to St. Mary Mead 3 months ago. "You did? Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "But 15 years ago, Diana Hartley was already quite familiar with Elderflower Lodge, wasn't she? Visiting her half-sister Florence, who was cataloguing the Colonel's collection." The elegant facade cracked slightly, a tremor passing through Diana's carefully composed features. "I don't know what you're implying, but Florence has already confessed to killing Eliza. The case is closed." "Is it?" Miss Marple's gentle voice carried unexpected authority. "Florence's confession doesn't match the forensic evidence, you see. Eliza was strangled, not struck down in a moment of anger, and Thomas Wright's convenient suicide seems rather too timely, especially with his note implicating you specifically." Diana's hand moved to her throat in an unconscious gesture. "Thomas implicated me? Impossible! I never even met the man. Yet he knew you as Diana Hartley, not Diana Carmichael. Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple stepped fully into the greenhouse now, her observant gaze taking in the disturbed soil where Diana had been searching. "What are you looking for, Mrs. Carmichael? Something else buried with Eliza that the police might have missed?" Before Diana could respond, a third voice entered the conversation, deep, cultured, and edged with a tension that belied its outward calm. "I believe my wife was looking for this." Professor Carmichael stood in the entrance to the greenhouse, his distinguished appearance somewhat diminished by the rain that had dampened his silver hair and the smudges of travel on his normally immaculate clothing. In his outstretched hand lay a small object, a locket on a fine silver chain. "Victor!" Diana's voice held equal measures of relief and wariness. "Where did you find it?" "In Charlotte's possession," the Professor replied, his gaze moving from Diana to Miss Marple. "She kept it all these years, along with a letter she never delivered. It seems Eliza gave it to her for safekeeping the afternoon before she died, along with instructions for it to be sent to Cambridge should anything happen to her." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Charlotte Carmichael, Your first wife was at the dinner party that night as well. She would have been the perfect confidant for a young woman planning her escape from an oppressive household. Charlotte recognized the danger immediately, the professor continued, his voice heavy with regret. She tried to warn me that evening, but I was too preoccupied with my academic grievances against the colonel to listen properly. By the time I understood, it was too late. Diana stepped forward, her hand extended toward the locket. Victor, darling, you're not thinking clearly. The journey has exhausted you. Let's go back to the house and stay where you are, Diana. The new voice came sharp and clear from behind the professor. James Pettigrew emerged from the shadows of the garden path, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief, a revolver held steadily in his right hand. I've heard enough of your lies. The tableau froze, Diana half reaching for the locket, the professor standing rigidly with arm extended, James keeping them both covered with the weapon, and Miss Marple observing, it all with her perceptive blue eyes. Mr. Pettigrew, she said calmly, I understand your distress, but this is hardly the way to resolve matters. James's laugh was hollow. Resolve matters? Eliza is dead. Has been for 15 years, while I lived under the same roof as her killer, married to her accomplice. What resolution is possible now? The truth, Miss Marple replied simply, which begins, I believe, with this locket. She turned to the professor. May I? With a slight nod, he placed the small silver oval in her outstretched palm. Miss Marple examined it carefully, noting the intricate engraving on its surface, intertwined initials that formed a curious pattern. E.M. and J.P., she read aloud, looking up at James with gentle understanding. Eliza Montague and James Pettigrew. You were more than guardian and ward, weren't you? More even than step-siblings. James's expression crumpled, the gun wavering slightly in his grasp. We were going to leave together, he said hoarsely, after her 21st birthday, when she received her inheritance. Cambridge for her, a fresh start for me, away from father's constant disapproval and the suffocating expectations of Elderflower Lodge, which presented quite a problem for certain parties, Miss Marple continued, her gaze shifting to Diana. If Eliza left with James, not only would her trust fund be beyond reach, but the colonel would likely disinherit his son as well. The entire Pettigrew fortune would be lost to those who had worked so carefully to secure their place within the family. Diana's composure, her final defense, shattered completely. You have no idea what it was like, she hissed, years of resentment breaking through her cultivated exterior. Florence and I grew up in poverty after our mother was abandoned by both our fathers. We had nothing while families like the Pettigrews lived in places like this, with their collections and their trust, funds and their easy privilege. So you targeted the colonel, Miss Marple concluded. Florence established herself by cataloguing his collection, then introduced you into the household as well, though more discreetly. But you didn't anticipate Eliza's determination to escape, nor her relationship with James. She would have ruined everything, Diana spat. The precious ward with her Cambridge acceptance and her devoted James. We'd spent months cultivating the colonel, positioning Florence as the perfect daughter-in-law. Prospect once Eliza was safely married off to someone of his choosing. Then suddenly she and James were planning to elope and take half the Pettigrew fortune with them. The professor's face had grown increasingly grave throughout this exchange. "The locket contains a photograph," he said quietly. "And something else Charlotte kept hidden all these years. Open it, Miss Marple." With careful fingers, Miss Marple pressed the tiny clasp. The locket sprang open to reveal not only a miniature photograph of James and Eliza, heads bent close together in youthful conspiracy, but also a folded scrap of paper tucked behind it. She gently extracted the paper and unfolded it, reading its contents with a slight widening of her eyes. "A copy of the Cambridge acceptance letter," she murmured, and on the back, a note in Eliza's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, know that it was not an accident. Diana has threatened to expose my relationship with James to the Colonel unless I renounce my inheritance in her favour. I fear what she might do." James made a sound of pure anguish, the revolver now hanging loosely from his fingers. "She never told me," he whispered. "She was trying to protect me from the scandal, knowing how much my father's approval meant, even as I claimed to despise it." "And so she went to the greenhouse that night to confront Diana," Miss Marple concluded, the final pieces falling into place. Not Florence, as everyone assumed. It was Diana who strangled her, Diana who placed the professor's stolen watch with the body to divert suspicion, Diana who orchestrated the entire deception, including your eventual marriage to Florence, ensuring the Hartley sisters' control over the Pettigrew fortune. "You can't prove any of this," Diana said, desperation giving her voice a shrill edge. "It's the ramblings of a confused old woman, and a note that could have been written any time." "Actually, Mrs. Carmichael," came Inspector Craddock's voice as he stepped into view behind James, Sergeant Mills at his side. "We have rather more than that. Thomas Wright didn't commit suicide. He was murdered, presumably by an accomplice you sent to silence him. And before his death, he provided a sworn statement detailing his role in moving Eliza's body to the greenhouse at your instruction." The officers moved forward to take Diana into custody. A sudden movement at the door of the main house caught Miss Marple's attention. The Colonel stood there, supported by Dr. Haydock, his once commanding figure now frail, but his eyes clear and fixed on the scene unfolding at his beloved greenhouse. In that moment, as rain fell steadily around them, and 15 years of secrets finally emerged into the light, Miss Marple saw not the distinguished military man, nor the wealthy landowner, but simply an old man facing the consequences of choices made long ago. Choices to preserve appearances at the cost of truth, to maintain control at the expense of justice. And in his eyes she recognized something beyond grief or shame. A terrible, haunting knowledge that he, too, had played his part in the tragedy of Eliza Montague. Chapter 9. The Reveal. 3 days after Diana Carmichael's arrest, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room with Inspector Craddock, a pot of properly brewed tea between them. The rain that had persisted since the confrontation at Elderflower Lodge had finally ceased, leaving the garden beyond the windows freshly washed and gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "I must thank you again for your invaluable assistance, Miss Marple," Craddock said, accepting a cup from his hostess. "Without your insights, I fear we might never have uncovered the full truth." "You're very kind, Inspector, but I merely observed what was already there to be seen," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Human nature follows such predictable patterns, you know. The Hartley sisters' scheme reminded me so much of the Brownlow case. In Much Benham, similar dynamics of ambition and calculation, though thankfully without the tragic outcome in that instance. Craddock smiled slightly at this characteristic reference. Nevertheless, your suggestion to seek out Charlotte Carmichael was the turning point. Without Eliza's locket and note, Diana might have maintained her deception indefinitely. Charlotte had been carrying that burden for 15 years, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. When I telephoned her in Cambridge, she seemed almost relieved to finally share what she knew. She had suspected Diana's involvement from the beginning, but lacked proof until now. And the professor? Craddock inquired. Charlotte confirmed. His account of their conversation that evening. Miss Marple nodded. She tried to warn him about Diana's threats against Eliza, but by then their marriage was already strained. The professor was preoccupied with his academic rivalry with the colonel, and dismissed her concerns as female hysteria. She sighed softly. By the time he realized the significance of what she'd been trying to tell him, Eliza was dead and his watch had been used to implicate him in her murder. A convenient scapegoat, Craddock observed, and one that Diana revisited 15 years later when she orchestrated their return to St. Mary Mead, knowing the greenhouse renovations would finally reveal Eliza's body. Diana always intended for her sister to take the blame if the truth emerged, Miss Marple said, her gentle face grave. Florence was merely a pawn in a much larger game, useful for gaining access to the Pettigrew household and fortune, but ultimately expendable. Florence's confession has been withdrawn, Craddock informed her, though she still faces charges as an accessory after the fact. Her statement to the magistrate was quite revealing. She claims she didn't know Diana had killed Eliza until afterward, when Diana appeared at her room in a state of agitation, confessing what she'd done and insisting Florence help her cover it up. And Florence complied, Miss Marple concluded, out of loyalty to her sister certainly, but also to protect her own position. The colonel's plan to marry her to James would have been jeopardized by a scandal. The colonel, Craddock said, his tone darkening. There's still the matter of his role in all this. Dr. Haydock says his condition is stabilizing, but he's unlikely to ever stand trial, given his age and health. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she resumed her knitting. The colonel's complicity was of a different nature, I think. He genuinely believed Eliza had run away that night. The station, Porter's testimony about driving a young woman to the train, was quite convincing after all. But when Simmons found the jade pendant in the greenhouse, she paused, her fingers momentarily still. That was when doubt first entered his mind. Yet he said nothing, Craddock pointed out, for 15 years. The colonel is a man who prizes order and control above all else, Miss Marple replied. Faced with the possibility that something terrible had happened to his ward, in his home, perhaps at the hands of someone in his social circle, he chose the more palatable explanation. Then, when the story of her departure was established, and time had passed, acknowledging any suspicions would have meant admitting his own failure to protect her, and implicated his son, Craddock added. James's relationship with Eliza would have created a scandal in itself, regardless of who killed her. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. So the colonel maintained the fiction, even to himself. The greenhouse became both a memorial and a prison for his conscience. He couldn't bear to be parted from it, yet never allowed anyone close enough to discover its secret. Through the window, they could see the vicar's wife engaged in earnest conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby on the garden path. News of Diana's arrest and the full story of Eliza's murder had spread through St. Mary Mead with predictable speed, providing fodder for endless discussion among the village gossips. "And James?" Craddock asked after a moment. "How is he taking all of this?" Miss Marple's expression softened with compassion. "As one might expect, the discovery that he spent 15 years married to the woman who helped conceal his true love's murder has been devastating. But there's a certain relief in finally knowing the truth, I think. He's left Elderflower Lodge, gone to stay with his mother's family in Northumberland, while he decides what to do with the estate." "And the Carmichaels?" Craddock inquired. "Diana remains in custody, awaiting trial, of course, but the Professor has returned to Cambridge," Miss Marple supplied. "Charlotte told me he's resigned his position, effective immediately. He plans to sell their house and travel abroad, somewhere far from the memories, I imagine." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's needles and the distant sounds of village life beyond the vicarage walls. After a while, Craddock spoke again, his tone reflective. "What I still don't entirely understand is how Diana maintained her deception for so long. To orchestrate not only Eliza's murder, but the entire cover-up, including her sister's marriage to James and her own to the Professor, then to return to the scene 15 years later. It suggests a level of calculation that's almost inhuman." "Not inhuman," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Merely human nature at its most determined. Diana grew up in genuine poverty, watching her sister Florence struggle for every opportunity. When they devised their plan to infiltrate the Pettigrew household, it wasn't just about money, but about claiming the social position they felt they deserved. Eliza represented everything they had been denied: security, education, prospects. Her death was tragically convenient for their ambitions." "And the Professor? How did Diana explain her previous connection to St. Mary Mead when she married him years later?" "She didn't need to," Miss Marple explained. "The Professor had been so preoccupied with his academic disputes the night of that dinner party that he barely registered the serving staff. Diana would have been practically invisible to him then, just another young woman helping in the background. When they met again at a museum function 5 years later, he had no reason to connect elegant Diana Hartley with a nameless servant from a forgettable country dinner." Craddock shook his head in reluctant admiration. "A perfect crime, or very nearly so." "There's no such thing, Inspector," Miss Marple responded firmly. "Sooner or later, the truth finds its way to the surface. Like the poor girl's remains in the greenhouse, buried beneath layers of deception, yet eventually revealed." She set aside her knitting and poured them each a fresh cup of tea. What proved Diana's undoing in the end was her own need to control the narrative. She could have remained safely anonymous in London when news of the discovery broke. Instead, she insisted on returning to St. Mary Mead with the Professor, ostensibly to establish their innocence, but actually to monitor exactly what evidence emerged. "And to retrieve the locket," Craddock added, "which she never found because Charlotte had kept it all these years. A small object with enormous significance," Miss Marple agreed. "Just like Eliza's jade pendant, These personal treasures often tell us more about a case than any official evidence. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the vicarage windows, casting long shadows across the carpet, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Eliza Montague, the bright young woman whose life had been cut short by ambition and deception. There was a certain justice in the fact that her own words, preserved in that tiny locket, had finally exposed her killer. "There will be a proper burial for Eliza next week," Craddock mentioned, as if following her train of thought. "James has requested a plot in the churchyard rather than the Pettigrew family mausoleum. He thought she would prefer it. Closer to the village life she was never fully allowed to participate in. A thoughtful choice," Miss Marple approved, "and perhaps a first step in his own healing process." Outside, the vicar's wife and her companions had been joined by several other villagers, their animated conversation suggesting that the case of Eliza Montague would provide St. Mary Mead with discussion material for months to come. Life would gradually return to its peaceful rhythm, the shocking events at Elderflower Lodge eventually becoming just another tale in the village's collective memory. But for those most intimately involved, James the Colonel, Florence, and the Professor, nothing would ever be quite the same. The secrets buried in the greenhouse had finally been unearthed, bringing with them a reckoning 15 years in the making. Miss Marple watched a robin alight on the garden wall, its bright presence a reminder that life continued even after tragedy. Human nature, with all its frailties and failings, remained as predictable as ever, but also as capable of redemption and renewal. It was this balance, this essential mixture of darkness and light, that had always fascinated her in her quiet observations of the world. And it was this understanding that had led her step by careful step to uncover the truth about what happened to Eliza Montague on that winter night 15 years ago, when ambition and fear had collided with devastating consequences in the Colonel's prized greenhouse. Chapter 10. Aftermath a week later, as the late June sunshine bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, a small gathering assembled in the village churchyard. Eliza Montague was finally being laid to rest, 15 years after her life had been so cruelly cut short. The simple headstone bore her name, the dates of her birth and death, and beneath them the words, "Her light returns to those who loved her." Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the main group, observing the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attentiveness. James Pettigrew, hollow-eyed but composed, placed a single white rose on the polished oak coffin. Beside him stood his father, the Colonel, looking frail in his wheelchair, but insisting on attending despite Dr. Haydock's concerns. The elderly military man's face remained impassive, though his trembling hand betrayed the emotion he struggled to contain. Professor Carmichael stood at a respectful distance, his academic bearing diminished by grief and regret. Though he had not known Eliza well, the knowledge that his watch had been used in the attempt to implicate him in her death had created a connection, a shared victimhood at Diana's hands. Charlotte Carmichael, his ex-wife, had come from Cambridge for the service, her dignified presence a testament to the promise she had made to a young woman long ago, that the truth would eventually be known. Inspector Craddock and Sergeant Mills represented the official presence, their attendance both professional and personal. For Craddock especially, the case had transcended mere duty. As the vicar spoke of redemption and justice, The inspector's gaze met Miss Marple's across the gathering, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey toward truth. After the service concluded, most attendees drifted toward the vicarage for refreshments. But Miss Marple remained behind, watching as James lingered at the graveside, his tall figure solitary against the backdrop of ancient yew trees. After a moment's hesitation, she approached him. "A beautiful service," she said gently. "I believe Eliza would have approved." James turned to her, grief etched into the lines of his face, yet somehow softer than before. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. Without you, we might never have known what really happened to her." "The truth has a way of emerging, Mr. Pettigrew, given time and attention." She glanced toward the colonel, who was being wheeled toward the church gate by Dr. Haydock. "How is your father taking all this?" James's expression grew complicated. "He's coming to terms with his part in it all, I think. We've had several difficult conversations this past week. There's much to forgive on both sides." "And will you?" Miss Marple asked. "Forgive him?" "I'm trying," James admitted. "He's still my father, despite everything." And in his own misguided way, he thought he was protecting the family name. He paused, looking down at the fresh earth of Eliza's grave. "I've decided to sell Elderflower Lodge. Too many shadows there now. Father will come with me to Northumberland. A fresh start for both of us. Away from the greenhouse and its secrets." They walked slowly through the churchyard. The conversation turned to Florence Pettigrew, who had been denied bail and remained in custody awaiting trial as an accessory to murder. "She claims she knew nothing of Diana's plan to kill Eliza," James said, his tone hardening slightly, "that she only helped conceal the body afterward out of fear of her sister and desire to protect her own position in the household. And do you believe her?" Miss Marple inquired gently. James considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure what I believe any more. 15 years of marriage to a woman who helped hide Eliza's body, who married me knowing what her sister had done." He shook his head in disbelief. "The Florence I thought I knew never existed." "Perhaps not entirely," Miss Marple suggested. "Human beings are complex creatures, Mr. Pettigrew, capable of both terrible deception and genuine emotion. Florence may have entered your life under false pretenses, but that doesn't necessarily mean every moment of your marriage was a lie." James nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "Diana is the one I can't comprehend. To kill Eliza so coldly, then orchestrate this elaborate deception over years. What kind of person is capable of such calculation?" "The kind who believes the end justifies any means," Miss Marple replied. "Diana and Florence grew up in genuine hardship, watching others enjoy privileges they were denied. For Diana particularly, this created a determination that bordered on obsession to secure the social position and financial security she felt entitled to, regardless of the cost." They had reached the church gate, where Craddock waited to speak with James about some final details of the case. Before joining him, James turned once more to Miss Marple. "Will you attend the trial when it begins?" he asked. "If my health permits," she replied, "though I suspect Diana may yet surprise us all. People of her particular temperament seldom face consequences willingly." Her words proved eerily prescient 3 days later, when news reached St. Mary Mead that Diana Carmichael had been found unconscious in her cell having somehow obtained a lethal dose of sleeping draught. Despite medical intervention, she never regained consciousness. The final chapter of Eliza's story had been written by Diana's own hand, a refusal to face judgment that was entirely in keeping with her character. The sensational case gradually receded from newspaper headlines, though it would be remembered as one of the most notorious crimes in the county's history. For the villagers of St. Mary Mead, it provided an inexhaustible source of discussion, with new theories and embellishments emerging with each retelling. Miss Marple returned to her quiet routine, her garden, her church work, her careful observation of human nature in all its predictable patterns. Yet occasionally, walking past St. Mary Mead's small churchyard, she would pause at Eliza's grave, remembering the bright young woman whose potential had been extinguished by ambition and jealousy. One golden autumn afternoon, Miss Marple was surprised to receive a small package delivered by the village postman. It contained a book, a first edition of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and a brief note from James Pettigrew explaining that it had been found among Eliza's few personal possessions, carefully hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, Bordersheidetjer, Elderflower Lodge. Inside the book's cover, Eliza had inscribed, "To remember that patience and perseverance sometimes have their rewards." Miss Marple placed the volume carefully on her bookshelf, touched by the gesture. That evening, as she knitted by the fire, her thoughts turned to the greenhouse at Elderflower Lodge. Now emptied of its exotic blooms, the building itself slated for demolition before the estate was sold. The Colonel's prized orchids had been donated to botanical gardens throughout the country, their delicate beauty preserved, though their collector's reputation was forever tarnished. The telephone rang, interrupting her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock, calling to inform her that Florence Pettigrew had pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for her full testimony about the events of that fateful night. She confirmed everything we suspected, Craddock explained. Diana was the mastermind from the beginning. Florence admired her sister's determination and vision, a way out of the poverty they'd known as children, but she claims she never anticipated murder. Yet she married James afterward, Miss Marple noted, knowing what Diana had done to Eliza. She says she had no choice by then, Craddock replied. Diana reminded her that she was equally complicit in concealing the body. And there was the matter of the Colonel's knowledge, or suspicion at least. Florence believed her only security lay in becoming indispensable to the Pettigrew household. After concluding the call, Miss Marple returned to her fireside chair, watching the flames dance against the gathering twilight. Human nature, with its capacity for both darkness and light, never ceased to fascinate her. Diana's ruthless ambition, Florence's moral compromise, the Colonel's willful blindness, James's enduring grief, all formed a tapestry of motivations as old as time itself. And at the centre of it all, Eliza Montague, a young woman whose only crime had been to seek independence and education, to love where her heart led her, rather than where duty dictated. Her story had finally been told, her remains properly laid to rest. Justice, though delayed, had ultimately prevailed. As darkness fell outside her cottage window, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. Beyond the garden gate, St. Mary, Mead settled into its evening rhythm, lights appearing in windows, the distant sound of the church clock striking the hour, the comforting certainty of village life continuing as it had for generations. Tomorrow would bring new concerns, perhaps even new mysteries to unravel, but for tonight, Miss Marple was content with the knowledge that even the most carefully buried secrets could not remain hidden forever, not from those who understood as she did that the truth always finds its way to the light. Like the exotic orchids in the Colonel's greenhouse, it simply required patience, attention, and the right conditions to finally bloom. Chapter 11. A year. Hence, 1 year after the discovery in the greenhouse, St. Mary Mead had resumed its tranquil rhythm. The scandal of Eliza Montague's murder gradually fading from daily conversation to occasional reminiscence. The seasons had completed their cycle, summer giving way to autumn, winter, and now spring once more, bringing fresh growth to gardens that had witnessed such drama. Miss Marple sat on a bench in the churchyard, her knitting needles moving steadily as she enjoyed the May sunshine. From her position, she had a clear view of Eliza's grave, now softened by a covering of spring flowers. She had made it her habit to visit once a week, removing spent blooms and occasionally placing a small posy from her own garden. "I thought I might find you here, Miss Marple." She looked up to see Inspector Craddock approaching along the gravel path, his official demeanour somewhat relaxed by the informal setting. "Inspector, what a pleasant surprise! I didn't realize you were in the area." "A brief visit only," Craddock replied, settling beside her on the bench. "A case in Market Basing brought me nearby, and I thought I'd stop to pay my respects." He nodded toward Eliza's headstone. "And to give you an update in person. Florence Pettigrew's appeal was denied yesterday. The original sentence stands." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. 5 years seems appropriate given her role. Not the primary agent, yet certainly complicit in the deception. "She's apparently adjusted well to prison life," Craddock continued, "teaches needlework to other inmates, and has become rather devout according to the chaplain. People often find faith when facing the consequences of their actions," Miss Marple observed. "I do hope it's genuine, for her sake." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a blackbird hop among the gravestones, searching for nesting material. "And the Colonel?" Craddock inquired. "Have you had any news?" "A letter from James arrived last week," Miss Marple replied. "They've settled well in Northumberland. The Colonel's health has stabilised, though he rarely speaks of St. Mary Mead or what happened." She paused, her needles momentarily still. "James mentioned that his father spends hours in the conservatory at their new home. Not with orchids this time. English roses have become his passion. Perhaps less exotic, but somehow more honest." "And James himself? How is he faring?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Better, I think. He's begun teaching mathematics at the local grammar school, finding purpose in nurturing young minds. Rather fitting, considering Eliza's academic aspirations." Craddock nodded in agreement. "And Elder Flower Lodge. Has it sold yet?" "Indeed, just last month. To a young couple from London with 3 small children. They've already begun renovations." Miss Marple's expression grew wistful. "The greenhouse has been completely dismantled. In its place, they're planning a children's garden with swings and a sandbox. Rather appropriate, don't you think? New life where there was such sadness." "Very fitting," Craddock agreed. And the Professor? Any word of him? Charlotte mentioned in her Christmas card that he's settled in Scotland. He's writing a book, not on his academic specialty, interestingly, but a memoir about his time in India. Coming to terms with the past, perhaps. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of the church clock striking the hour and the gentle click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. After a moment, Craddock spoke again, his tone reflective. "You know, Miss Marple, in all my years of police work, I've never encountered a case quite like this one. Not just the crime itself, but the web of deception that followed. 15 years of carefully maintained lies, all unraveling because of a planned greenhouse renovation. Human nature has a remarkable capacity for self-delusion," Miss Marple replied. The Colonel convinced himself that Eliza had truly run away, despite evidence to the contrary. Florence persuaded herself that marrying James was justified, despite the terrible secret she carried. Even Diana, with all her calculated planning, believed she could return to the scene 15 years later without consequences. Yet in the end truth prevailed, Craddock observed. It usually does, Inspector, given sufficient time and attention. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Like my garden, one must observe carefully, notice which plants thrive and which struggle, recognize the patterns of growth and decay. Human behavior follows similar principles if one has the patience to watch and wait. As they rose to depart, Miss Marple cast a final glance at Eliza's grave. The simple headstone caught the afternoon sunlight, its inscription clearly visible. Her light returns to those who loved her. She would have been 36 this year, Miss Marple remarked softly. Perhaps a professor herself by now, or a writer, or a mathematician like James. So much potential, extinguished by fear and ambition. But not forgotten, Craddock reminded her gently. No, not forgotten, Miss Marple agreed. And that matters, I think. They walked together through the lich gate, pausing where their paths would diverge. Craddock toward his waiting car, Miss Marple toward her cottage at the edge of the village. I suppose this concludes the case officially, Craddock said. With Diana dead, Florence imprisoned, and all the facts established as far as they can be. Yes, I believe it does, Miss Marple nodded. Though there's one small detail that has always intrigued me. Oh, what's that? The young woman the station porter drove to the train that morning. The one who resembled Eliza. Diana arranged that deception, presumably using someone who looked similar enough in the pre-dawn light to be convincing. But who was she? Another pawn in Diana's elaborate game? Or perhaps someone with her own part in the story? Craddock looked startled. I'd assumed it was Diana herself, playing the role to establish the fiction of Eliza's departure. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. Yet the timing has always troubled me. If Diana had just committed murder and concealed the body temporarily, would she risk being seen at the station at exactly the time Eliza was supposed to depart? It seems unnecessarily dangerous, when another accomplice could have played that role. Another accomplice besides Florence and Thomas Wright? Craddock frowned. That would suggest a conspiracy broader than we've established. Miss Marple shrugged lightly. Merely an old lady's speculation, Inspector. The case is solved, the guilty punished, and justice served as well as it can be after so many years. As they parted ways, Craddock couldn't help wondering if the intuitive old lady had once again noticed something that had eluded more conventional investigators, but he dismissed the thought almost immediately. The case was closed, its complexities untangled, its tragic story complete. Miss Marple continued her walk home, enjoying the sights and sounds of St. Mary Mead in springtime, Mrs. Bantry tending her front garden, the vicar's wife hurrying toward the parish hall with a stack of hymn books, the butcher's boy making deliveries on his bicycle, life continuing in its predictable patterns, the village absorbing and gradually forgetting the drama that had briefly disrupted its tranquillity. At her garden gate, Miss Marple paused, struck by the sight of a particularly fine rosebush in full bloom. The deep crimson flowers reminded her of something the Colonel had once said about his prized orchids. "Beauty and deception often grow together, Miss Marple. The most exquisite blooms can be the most dangerous." How true that was of human nature as well, she reflected. Behind the most polished social facades often lurked the darkest impulses, just as Diana's elegant exterior had concealed a calculating murderer. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple placed her knitting in its basket and moved to the bookshelf where Eliza's copy of Persuasion stood. She ran her fingers gently over the spine, remembering the inscription, "To remember that patience and perseverance sometimes have their rewards." For Eliza, justice had come too late, but it had come nevertheless. The secrets buried in the greenhouse had finally been exposed to the light, allowing truth, however painful, to flourish at last. Miss Marple turned to the window, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her garden. Another case concluded, another pattern of human behaviour observed and understood. And perhaps somewhere, in whatever realm lay beyond this one, a bright young woman with emerald eyes finally rested in peace, knowing that she had not been forgotten after all.